The 3-day pause is over, the talks collapsed, and now Canada has actually pulled the trigger. On Tuesday, the Canadian government stood up and announced exactly what it had been threatening for days: tariffs on more than 700 American products, dollar for dollar, matching the 50% duties the United States imposed just days earlier. We are laying out exactly what Canada announced, why it happened now specifically, what it actually covers, and what comes next in a trade war that just took its sharpest turn yet. Let's start with the timeline, because the speed of what happened here matters. Trade negotiations between Canada and the United States, negotiations that had briefly produced a tentative pause just days earlier, collapsed late Friday night. According to Canadian officials, Canada could not accept what the U.S. had offered. With no deal in place, President Trump's 50% tariffs on a broad range of Canadian goods worth approximately $20 billion took effect on Saturday, August 22nd. Notably, these tariffs applied even to goods that would otherwise have been protected under the existing Canada-U.S. trade agreement, known as CUSMA, and unlike some earlier rounds of this dispute, they came with no expiry date attached. Then, on Monday, Trump escalated further, announcing new tariffs on Canadian autos that would double the existing rate to 50%, starting January 1st. In the same stretch of days, Trump also made comments that added a strange, almost surreal layer to an already tense situation, saying he was considering renaming Lake Ontario, the easternmost of the Great Lakes bordering the Canadian province of Ontario, to Lake America. By Tuesday, August 25th, Canada responded. The Canadian government announced it would impose tariffs on $27.6 billion Canadian dollars, or approximately $19.9 billion worth of American goods, explicitly framed as matching the new American duties dollar for dollar. Canada's Finance Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, described it plainly, stating, "Our dollar for dollar, rate for rate counter-tariffs, as well as a multi-billion-dollar support package will protect workers, farmers, families, and businesses." So what exactly is covered under this new round of Canadian tariffs? According to the government's own statement, the counter-tariffs apply to more than 700 different products, with rates set at 15%, 25%, and 50%. Depending on the specific good, drawn directly from the same categories the United States had targeted under its own Section 338 and Section 232 tariffs. In practice, this means Canada set its tariff rate on each specific product to match whatever rate the United States had applied to the equivalent Canadian product, an approach designed specifically to demonstrate proportional, symmetrical retaliation rather than an arbitrary or escalatory response. The sectors affected span a genuinely wide range of the American economy. According to Canadian government statements, the list focuses specifically on steel and aluminum, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, plastics, and electronics, the same sectors Canadian officials say have been most heavily impacted by the American tariffs in the first place. One especially notable detail: Canada is doubling its own duties on American steel and aluminum up to 50%, explicitly matching the 50% tariffs the United States had already placed on Canadian steel and aluminum before this most recent round even began. Canadian officials framed this specific move as a means of protecting Canadian manufacturing, a sector that has been under sustained pressure throughout this entire 18-month trade war. Beyond the specific sectors named in official statements, reporting on the details of this list points to an enormously broad range of everyday consumer products caught up in these new tariffs, everything from makeup to smartphones to kitchen appliances. That breadth matters for understanding the practical scope of this announcement. This is not a narrow, symbolic gesture targeting a handful of politically sensitive goods. It is a wide-reaching response touching product categories that show up in ordinary households and businesses across both countries. It is worth reflecting for a moment on how deliberately different this feels compared to the more narrowly targeted, politically symbolic tariff moves that characterized earlier phases of this dispute, like the provincial alcohol bans specifically aimed at signaling displeasure without inflicting broad economic pain across the entire American economy. A list spanning more than 700 products, touching everything from cosmetics to industrial steel, represents a fundamentally different scale of response, one built to be felt broadly across many different corners of the American economy simultaneously, rather than concentrated symbolically in a handful of politically sensitive categories, the way some earlier retaliatory measures in this dispute had been designed. These new counter-tariffs are set to take effect on September 8, 2026, giving businesses on both sides of the border a roughly 2-week window to prepare before the new rates actually apply. That timing detail is worth noting, since it mirrors a pattern seen throughout this broader dispute, announcing a tariff response with some lead time before implementation, rather than imposing it immediately and without warning. It is also important to understand that this new round of tariffs does not exist in isolation. According to reporting on Canada's current tariff exposure, Canada is now facing 3 distinct, separate sets of American tariffs simultaneously. First, the 50% tariffs under Section 338, the ones that triggered this entire latest round, covering roughly $28 billion worth of goods imposed over the weekend. Second, sectoral tariffs under Section 232, covering steel, aluminum, automobiles, and softwood lumber, tariffs that had already been in place since the previous year, well before this most recent escalation. And third, a 10% tariff imposed earlier this year under Section 301, connected to a U.S. forced labor investigation. Layered together, these 3 separate sets of American tariffs represent a genuinely complex, multi-front trade dispute that Canada is now responding to primarily through this new, broad counter-tariff package. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a single trading relationship to be operating under 3 distinct, simultaneously active tariff regimes at once, each triggered by a different legal mechanism and a different underlying justification. Most trade disputes, even contentious ones, tend to consolidate around a single active dispute at any given time, with earlier rounds either resolved or folded into a broader renegotiated framework. The fact that Canada is currently navigating Section 338, Section 232, and Section 301 tariffs simultaneously, each with its own separate legal basis, its own separate list of covered goods, and its own separate timeline, reflects just how fragmented and how sustained this particular trade conflict has become over its 18-month history, compared to a more typical single-track trade dispute between 2 countries. Alongside the tariff announcement itself, Canada also rolled out a significant domestic support package aimed at cushioning the impact on Canadian workers and businesses. The federal government announced $7.5 billion in new and enhanced support measures, including assistance for small and medium-sized businesses, a dedicated stream for helping companies manage cash flow pressures created by the tariffs, and support specifically targeted at workers whose jobs are considered at risk because of this new round of trade action. Within that broader package, an additional $1.5 billion is being delivered specifically through what is called the Regional Tariff Response Initiative, with that particular funding stream coordinated jointly between the Business Development Bank of Canada and Canada's various regional development agencies, an approach designed to make sure support reaches businesses in the specific regions and industries most directly affected, rather than being distributed as a single, undifferentiated national fund. Reaction from Canada's own business community has been generally supportive of the government's approach, while also emphasizing the urgency of actually getting that support money out the door quickly. Candice Lang, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, said, "The government is now moving at the speed of business to address the current trade negotiation collapse," adding a pointed warning about the stakes involved. If the government did not prioritize speed, some businesses would not still be there by the time support rolls out. That comment captures something important about the practical, on-the-ground reality of a trade dispute like this one. For companies operating on thin margins or already stretched thin by 18 months of accumulated tariff pressure, the difference between support arriving quickly versus arriving after some bureaucratic delay can genuinely determine whether a business survives the specific round of escalation. Industry-specific reactions were more measured and cautious. The Forest Products Association of Canada, representing an industry directly affected given the inclusion of pulp and paper products in this new tariff list, said it was still reviewing the details of the measures, but welcomed what it called the early outreach from government to businesses in the sector. That kind of careful, still evaluating response is fairly typical in the immediate aftermath of a major policy announcement this complex, an acknowledgement that the government is taking the issue seriously without yet fully committing to a judgment on whether the specific details will actually deliver the relief the industry needs. This more cautious tone from specific industry groups, compared to the broader, more enthusiastic support voiced by organizations like the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, reflects a genuinely different vantage point. Broad business associations tend to evaluate government action primarily on whether it demonstrates responsiveness and speed criteria. The $7.5 billion package clearly satisfies on its face. Sector-specific associations, by contrast, need to evaluate whether the actual mechanics of the support, how funds get distributed, which specific companies qualify, and how quickly money actually reaches affected businesses will translate into meaningful relief for their particular members. A judgment that reasonably takes more time and more scrutiny of the fine print before committing to a fully enthusiastic public response. Prime Minister Mark Carney's own public remarks around this announcement continued a pattern of language he has used consistently throughout recent weeks of escalating tension. At the announcement itself, Carney stated, "Canada has what the world wants, and we will not allow any nation to determine our future," adding that the government was investing $7.5 billion specifically to provide the stability that Canada's economy and people need during this period. That framing, emphasizing stability, self-determination, and Canada's own resource strengths, echoes almost exactly the language Carney has used in other recent public statements about the broader trade relationship, including his comments describing the old, deeply integrated relationship between the two economies as fundamentally changed. It is worth stepping back and placing this specific round of counter-tariffs within the much longer arc of this trade dispute, because the scale and pattern of escalation becomes clearer with that context. This trade war traces back to February of 2025, when the United States first imposed tariffs on Canadian goods, and Canada responded almost immediately with its own retaliatory measures. Back in that earlier round, Canada announced a much larger potential scope of tariffs, up to $155 billion worth of American goods, though the actual first phase implemented at that time covered a more modest $30 billion, including products like orange juice, peanut butter, wine, spirits, beer, coffee, appliances, apparel, footwear, motorcycles, and cosmetics. That initial framework explicitly reserved the option to expand further if the American tariffs continued or escalated, a threshold that, as we now know, was eventually crossed multiple times over the following 18 months. Comparing that earlier 2025 framework to this current round reveals an important shift in approach. The original threat structure was built around an enormous ceiling, $155 billion, that Canada held largely in reserve as a deterrent, only implementing smaller phases as needed. This current round, by contrast, is framed explicitly as dollar for dollar, rate for rate matching, a more disciplined, proportional response tied directly and specifically to the exact scale and structure of what the United States had just imposed, rather than an open-ended escalating threat. That shift in framing from a large reserved ceiling to precise, matched retaliation reflects a deliberate communications choice by Carney's government, positioning Canada's response as measured and reactive rather than aggressive or disproportionate, even while the actual dollar figures involved remain genuinely substantial. It is also worth understanding why the specific sectors chosen for this round, steel, aluminum, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, plastics, and electronics, were selected the way they were. Canadian officials have been explicit that this list is built to mirror the sectors most heavily impacted by the American tariffs in the first place, rather than targeting politically sensitive or symbolically important American industries, independent of that connection. This mirroring approach serves a specific diplomatic and legal purpose. By tying Canada's tariff rates and product selections directly to the equivalent American tariffs on Canadian goods, Canada strengthens its own position, both domestically and in any future dispute resolution processes. That its response is a proportional defensive countermeasure rather than an independent aggressive trade action of its own initiative. There is also a currency detail worth clarifying here, since different sources reporting on this story have used slightly different dollar figures, which can understandably create confusion. The headline figure most commonly cited, $28 billion, generally refers to the value in Canadian dollars, which converts to approximately 19.9 to 20 billion US dollars given current exchange rates. Some reports round this to 20 billion, others to 28 billion, depending on which currency is being referenced. Both figures describe the same underlying tariff package, just expressed in different national currencies, and it is worth being aware of that distinction when comparing coverage across different outlets, some of which default to Canadian dollar figures given the source of the announcement, while others convert immediately to US dollar equivalents for their primarily American audience. Now let's talk about what this means practically for people and businesses on both sides of the border, because a trade dispute at this scale inevitably produces real, tangible consequences, well beyond the diplomatic statements and press conferences. On the American side, the immediate concern centers on how quickly and how visibly these new Canadian tariffs will translate into higher prices for American consumers and reduced competitiveness for American exporters trying to sell into the Canadian market. Given that this list touches everyday products, cosmetics, smartphones, kitchen appliances, alongside more specialized industrial goods like steel, aluminum, and agricultural equipment, the practical impact is likely to be broadly distributed across the American economy rather than concentrated narrowly in one or two sectors. American manufacturers who rely on Canada as an export market for these specific product categories will face reduced demand as Canadian buyers either absorb higher costs or shift toward domestic or alternative international suppliers instead. On the Canadian side, the $7.5 billion support package reflects an acknowledgement that this round of retaliation, however necessary Canadian officials consider it to be, will impose real costs on Canadian businesses and workers as well. Retaliatory tariffs are never a costless action for the country imposing them. Canadian companies that import American steel, aluminum, or industrial equipment as inputs into their own production processes will face higher costs themselves, potentially offsetting some of the protective benefit these tariffs are intended to provide to competing Canadian producers in those same sectors. This is part of why the government paired the tariff announcement with a substantial domestic support package, rather than treating the tariffs as a standalone policy action with no accompanying need for economic cushioning. There is a broader economic principle worth naming plainly here, since it applies to essentially every retaliatory tariff round in this 18-month dispute, not just this specific one. Tariffs function as a tax paid primarily by importers and ultimately by the consumers and businesses in the country imposing them, not by the exporting country whose goods are being taxed. This means Canada's own counter-tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and equipment will raise costs for Canadian businesses that rely on those specific American imports, even as those same tariffs are intended to protect competing Canadian producers in the same sectors. Untangling exactly how those two effects, higher costs for importers versus protection for domestic competitors, net out for the Canadian economy overall, is a genuinely complex economic question. And it is part of why the accompanying support package matters just as much as the tariff announcement itself, for understanding the full picture of what this policy actually does. It is also worth considering the broader auto sector dimension specifically, given Trump's Monday announcement doubling auto tariffs to 50% starting January 1st. This detail adds a forward-looking complication to an already tense situation, since it signals further escalation is already scheduled to occur independent of whatever happens with this current round of counter-tariffs. The North American auto industry remains one of the most deeply integrated manufacturing sectors between these two countries, with components and partially assembled vehicles crossing the border multiple times during a single production cycle. The scheduled doubling of auto tariffs taking effect at the start of next year means both governments and the auto industry itself now have a fixed, known deadline to plan around, separate from, and in addition to the current dispute playing out over the September 8th counter-tariff implementation date. The Lake Ontario renaming comment, while it may sound like a minor, almost comedic aside compared to the substantive economic policy being discussed, is worth including here because it reflects something real about the tone this dispute has taken on in its most recent phase. Trade disputes conducted primarily through formal government statements and structured tariff schedules are one thing. A sitting American president publicly floating the idea of renaming a body of water that borders Canadian territory represents a different, more personally charged register of rhetoric, one that several observers covering this dispute have noted marks a genuine shift in tone compared to earlier, more strictly transactional phases of this 18-month trade war. So, pulling this together, where does this leave the overall Canada-U.S. trade relationship as of this specific moment? Canada is now facing three simultaneous overlapping sets of American tariffs. The new 50% Section 338 tariffs, the existing Section 232 sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, and the 10% Section 301 tariffs tied to the forced labor investigation. In response, Canada has announced a broad proportional counter-tariff package covering more than 700 American products, set to take effect September 8th, alongside a substantial domestic support package intended to protect Canadian workers and businesses from the costs of both the American tariffs and Canada's own retaliatory response. Additional escalation is already scheduled for January 1st with the doubling of auto tariffs, meaning this current round of tit-for-tat retaliation is unlikely to represent the final chapter in this dispute. Even once the September 8th implementation date arrives and passes, this latest escalation also needs to be understood against the backdrop of just how close these two countries had come to a different outcome only days earlier. The brief pause in tariffs that had been announced just before this collapse represented a genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to find a negotiated path forward. The fact that talks broke down so completely so soon after that pause, that both governments moved directly into this kind of broad mutual retaliation, illustrates just how difficult finding common ground in this relationship has become, even when both sides have repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to keep talking and keep searching for some kind of workable arrangement. That whiplash, from a tentative pause to full mutual retaliation within a matter of days, is worth sitting with as its own data point about the state of this relationship. It suggests that whatever specific disagreements ultimately caused the earlier pause to collapse, likely tied to the same underlying sticking points around auto tariff calculations and dairy access that had already proven difficult to resolve in the days leading up to that brief window of optimism, those disagreements were substantial enough that neither side was willing to extend the pause further or accept a partial, incomplete resolution simply to avoid moving directly into this next round of escalation. It is also worth noting what continues to remain conspicuously absent from this latest round of escalation: energy. Despite the breadth of this new 700 product tariff list, spanning steel, dairy, electronics, agricultural equipment, and dozens of other categories, oil, natural gas, potash, and critical minerals remain untouched, continuing a pattern that has held consistently throughout this entire 18-month dispute. Whatever else gets caught up in this escalating cycle of tariffs and counter-tariffs, both governments have continued, even now, to treat the energy relationship between these two countries as the one line neither side is willing to cross. That consistency is genuinely remarkable, given everything else that has changed throughout this dispute. Tariff rates have climbed from an initial 25% up to 50%. The list of covered goods has expanded from a narrower initial set into more than 700 distinct products. The rhetoric between the two governments has escalated from cautious diplomatic language to a sitting president joking about renaming a Great Lake. And yet, through all of that escalation, energy has remained the one category both governments have consistently carved out, round after round, regardless of which specific legal mechanism or tariff section was being used to justify the broader dispute at any given moment. That pattern, more than any single tariff announcement, may ultimately say the most about where the genuine, practical limits of this trade war actually sit. That is the real, documented picture of where this trade war stands right now, based on official statements from Canada's Department of Finance, on the record comments from Canadian officials, including Finance Minister Champagne and Prime Minister Carney, and reporting on the specific scope, timing, and sector breakdown of this new counter-tariff package. With implementation set for September 8th, an additional auto tariff escalation already scheduled for January, this specific round of retaliation is best understood not as a conclusion to this trade dispute, but as the latest and currently sharpest chapter in a relationship that continues to escalate even as both governments periodically signal openness to eventually finding a way back to the negotiating table.